Hello, and welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to be discussing a final book which I reread for middle grade March, So Far from the Bamboo Grove by Yoko Kawashima Watkins. It's a memoir she wrote of her when she was like 11 through 12 years old in 1945 through 46, and there's also a sequel called My Brother, My Sister and I, and in the first memoir, her mother and her older sister Ko, who's 16, later turned 17, they're fleeing from Nanam in northern Korea after the war starts to turn against Japan, and they have to go back home into Japan, and they're without the father and the brother, and it's a really intense story. This isn't what I would consider it typical middle grade. It's definitely not if you're one of those think of the children type and think all middle grade books should be all glitter and rainbows and like daisies and flowers and puppies and kittens and stuff like that. This is really difficult stuff Yoko goes through at 11 years old. So it's definitely lots of realism. I'm apologizing if I'm rambling again. So her family is well off. Though they're Japanese, they are living in Korea, which Japan occupied at the time. But obviously Yoko has nothing to do with political and government decisions. She's only a child, and her mother also expresses displeasure with the Japanese government. And Yoko's father is working with the government, so he's away from home a lot of times, and sometimes he'll go to Manchuria. They're about 50 miles away from the Manchurian border, and on July 29th, 1945, her mother, and her sister have to flee from the house when, the Korean communists start taking over. And, their brother, Hideo, is away at an ammunition factory. He's not due to come home yet. And so they have to basically leave without him. They, take as many important possessions as they can, clothes and documents and things. They put him in big sacks and they carry them with them. And because it's so dark, the mother ties her daughters to her wrists with ropes, and right shortly after the book begins, there's I wouldn't say super long, but I guess maybe 5-10 pages of flashback of the months leading up to this. Normally I don't like when books do this, either start when the story starts, or just don't do a flashback at all, just sprinkle in relevant information. But here it actually worked well. It didn't feel like info dump, backstory garbage. It actually felt like a part of the story, because these little episodes are fleshed out, and we learn about how the people came to the house collecting precious metals to help the war effort. And they even took Yoko's mother's glasses and put it in the box with all the precious metals the family had, including some heirlooms, and they smashed her glasses. And then Yoko's father and his friends are horrified when they learn about this. They say, oh, the government shouldn't have taken your eyeglasses, you can't see without them, we'll get you a free new pair immediately. And Yoko tries to protest the soldiers taking all their things, particularly because they're threatening and saying nasty things to her mother. And she jumps on the soldiers, and in return they throw her to the ground and start kicking her and injuring her pretty badly. And so that's just a horrible thing. She realizes the ugliness of war. And she also talks about how she's doing well in school, but she's also forced to take girly stuff by her mother, for example, tea ceremonies and dancing, and she's really not interested in that at all. She's kind of more tomboyish, like I've always been, and she has kind of a difficult relationship with her older sister Ko, although the book is dedicated to my honorable sister Ko. It's kind of understandable when there's a big age difference between siblings, particularly at 11 and 16. They're not going to have many things in common, and the older sister is going to seem really bossy and stuff, and the younger sister is going to seem like a whiny little brat to the older sister, because they're just not at the same place in life, and they can't understand where one another is coming from. And so anyway, they have to get out. And before, I'm sorry, I forgot to mention this, before they leave the house, they when they're doing the dancing stuff, they go to a hospital where they're wounded soldiers, and at the end of the hall, there's a very, very wounded corporal, Corporal Matsumura, and he really takes a liking to Yoko, even though his whole face is bandaged and his a lot of other wounds all over his body. And he really likes her, even though she's not the most outgoing person or the biggest person. He just thinks she's a really special person. And eventually after the bandage comes off of his face and he's able to move around again, he comes to visit her family several times, and it's through this connection that he's able to get the Kawashima women on a hospital train leaving Korea. They're the only non-wounded people on this train, but because they have special permission from him, they're able to get on that train after a very terrifying flight away from their home before the soldiers get there and start ransacking it. And the train is filled with, like people in terrible state of wounded. And there are a couple of like pregnant women, and there's a woman with a baby, and just some doctors and nurses there. And they're under, constant threat from the Koreans as they're fleeing. And just Yoko sees some really, really horrible things on this train. Many like children in the West, they're very, very lucky to never have witnessed like, people dying, having to throw dying people off of a train, like a woman giving birth, and then Yoko has to give up her blanket to cover the woman, and it gets all bloody. And of course, being 11 years old and, rather pampered up to that point, she doesn't like, forced sharing, even if it's like for a very important reason. Then like a baby dies on the train, and then eventually the train comes under heavy fire. And even though the train can be repaired, they decide to just like get off and walk the rest of the way to Seoul, where they can get a train or a boat back home into, I'm sorry, obviously it has to be a boat because like Korea is an island, or not an island, like a peninsula. And so yeah, obviously Japan is on the coast as well. So they're going to go to Seoul, get another train there, and then take a boat home to Japan. But obviously this journey is fraught with much danger too. And obviously, three women without any male protection, they're like at constant risk of rape. And at one point, these three Korean communists find them when they're in the woods, and they're like thinking, "Oh, Ko, you're just the right age for us to have fun with." And the Kawashima ladies like flatten themselves when some airplanes start flying overhead, and the three Korean soldiers are killed by this. That was like obviously it's horrible when anybody is killed in war, but that was like a lucky miracle for them, because they were not only like their lives were saved and Ko was not assaulted, they also get to like strip these soldiers of their clothes, and they can pose as Koreans themselves, and they also like shave their hair, and so they pretend to be men, which is obviously much safer. Many people in the West today are they're very like privileged not to realize like many women and girls in the past had to like cross dress for their own safety, because it just like being openly a woman, particularly if you were all by yourself, you were at constant threat of violence and things, and there were other like things you just weren't allowed to do. And later on, when they're in a train station, again, they have to pretend to be men because, it's just safer for them. And there's also some chapters with Yoko's older brother, Hideo. He was planning to join the military at the start of the book, and his family was very upset. He's an only son. The war seems to be almost over. You're too intelligent and well off to do this. Let other boys serve for us. And he says, I'm going to do it. And then he ends up failing his test to join the army. He's fine with the physical exam, but with the written exam, he's like putting a lot of like questions. They suspect he failed it on purpose. Like these are like baby questions even. Yoko would know the answers to. And by the way, they only call Yoko Little One throughout the book. They only call her by her first name when she's in trouble. And she also frequently calls her sister Ko, honorable sister, instead of Ko. So there's just, something the Japanese do. And anyway, Hideo is in the ammunition factory. He's supposed to work there 6 days a week and then go home 1 day a week. And then these Korean communist soldiers come into the factory and start murdering everybody. Hideo is rescued because he like hides in a box, and three of his buddies are in the bathroom when it happens, and they like hide together in a stall, and they escape the factory, seconds before it's like exploded with a bomb or the grenades by the Koreans. And they go to a house of a Korean family. They knew the Lees, and the Lees have sadly, been killed or taken away, but they do, take some Korean clothes and things. And then Hideo goes to his family's house. It's been ransacked already, and he doesn't know what happened to his mother and sisters, but he does, take a few important things he finds that are still there, like a photo album and a savings book. And he finds a note they wrote saying, they're on their way to Seoul. Please meet us here, like be as fast as you can. And so he and his friends, take off. They're heading to Seoul too. And at one point, they also, obviously, they're dressing as Koreans because, it's just much safer to not be openly Japanese when the tide is turning against him. And I did make a mistake in my, I think it was my TBR video. I said Hideo is rescued by a family called the Lees. The family who rescues him later in the book are the Kims. The Lees are the family whom they visit like towards the beginning of their journey, and they take some clothes from them. And he has a very, very strong like love bond with these people. He loves both of these Korean families who have helped him. So like people who claim this book is anti-Korean, that's like total crap. I mean, guess I'll get into that a bit later, and like obviously Yoko and her mother and her sister, they have a very like, difficult journey back home into Japan, but eventually they do make it into a refugee center, and they no longer have to pretend to be Koreans, and then they get on a ship too, even though Hideo hasn't joined them in time, and they have no idea where the father is. And when they go to Japan, it's kind of a rude awakening for them. They're not welcomed with open arms, and they don't know what happened to Yoko's grandparents, and they've heard about the terrible bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and eventually they take up residence in a train station. They are not even able to live in a proper house, and once again they have to pretend to be men at this. I'm sorry, not at the train station they eventually settle into, but a train station before this. They have to like shave their heads again, and Ko has to bind her breasts, and they have to just look for all intents and purposes like men, and they have to go to the toilet standing up because there's a lot of women being sexually assaulted in the toilets, as we all know from statistics when bathrooms are unisex, but that's a whole topic for another story. And they also have to hide the family sword so it won't be confiscated as a weapon when they sail into Japan. And it's obviously just going from a life of privilege to a life of getting food out of garbage cans, and having to wear the same clothes over and over again, and never let these like heavy rucksacks out of their sight, and just not even having a lot of guaranteed money. And Yoko has to go to school with a lot of spoiled rich girls when the family goes to Kyoto, and Kyoko goes to a university. She's smart enough to bypass the rest of high school, and she majors in home economics. And then just a horrible tragedy happens with the mother at the train station when Ko is away for a few hours with some great idea to make extra money. Yoko doesn't find out about it until much later, and Yoko is made fun of by the girls at her new elementary school because she's picking like stuff out of the trash, like the papers are thrown away. They didn't use the back of them, and she has no money to buy textbooks and papers and things, and she makes friends with the janitor, Mr. Naida, and he like gives her all the the papers these like spoiled girls are throwing away, and they also throw away things like dictionaries and erasers and India ink and just like all these things. Like why would you throw away these good things? And it also reminded me when you grow up poor and working class, you don't take anything for granted. You use things and you fix things, and you find ingenious ways to save money. You don't just, oh, this shoe broke, I'll just throw it away instead of fixing it, or I throw this paper away because I've used one side of it, but I'm not going to use the second side of it. And just so many horrible things she goes through. But eventually they do like find some friends who agree to help them, and Hideo is still missing, and they're still having to struggle and sacrifice, even though they do eventually get a place like a four walls and like a roof over their heads at upstairs from a clog factory. This woman like takes pity on them after something that happens with their mother and says, "Oh, my husband and I have a clog factory, and it was robbed, and we would appreciate someone living there so they can keep an eye on the place." And their fortune slowly starts to turn around from there. And Yoko enters an essay contest, and Corporal Matsumura comes back to Japan, and they he helps them a little bit too. And we also see Hideo slowly making his way back home. He and his three buddies part ways at one point. They feel it would be safer if they go alone, and they say like if we all survive, we'll meet in 5 years at Tokyo Bridge. And Hideo falls unconscious in the snow outside of a farmhouse above the 38th parallel, and the family, the Kims, like take him in. He's almost dead. They warm him back up, nurse him back to health, and they start loving him like a member of their own family. And they claim he's a relative, a Korean, because it would be so dangerous if people found out he was a Japanese guy. And he says, "Look, I have to go home and see what happened to my family, even though it might be so dangerous to cross the river and like leave northern Korea." And they like are crying and begging him not to go. And he says, "Look, I love you guys, but I just have to go. This is my family." And they have a very emotional farewell, and he like has a dangerous swim across the river with his like big heavy bag on his head. But he does make it. And out of love for his Korean friends, he continues carrying his rucksack or his sack around his hips even after he's back in Japan or even in southern Korea, because he just loved these people so much, and it's an emotional attachment to them, even though it's no longer dangerous to carry like a rucksack on his back in the Japanese way, and there's so many like things throughout the book. This is, like differences in cultures many people in the West aren't aware of. They just think, oh, all Asian are, exactly the same, which, is very unfortunate. I wish people like understand like about more the differences between, Japanese and Koreans. And just, it's a wonderful, wonderful memoir. I would highly recommend. It's not just for middle grade people. It's kind of like Ida Voss's books, particularly her more mature ones, like The Key is Lost and Dancing on the Bridge of Avignon. Yeah, sure, it's like intended primarily for like preteens, but it's written in such a way that adults can enjoy it too, and it's not content that's only specific to preteens. And as I've mentioned, this book has been frequently banned and challenged, because like Yoko was a privileged Japanese girl living in Korea, and the Japanese were obviously committing horrible war crimes during World War II, and they were like occupying Korea, which was also wrong. And they're like basically saying, oh, she was an evil oppressor, and like how dare like people supposed to feel sympathy with her story, and just not taking any sympathy with it, like a young girl, and reading what it actually says. They have loved Koreans and they're not anti-Korean at all. It's just they were like afraid of the Korean communists for like obvious reasons, although many of these like wokesters nowadays, they like claim like unironically to be communists in their like Twitter bios and such, but I don't really think they could be, because these like privileged like bourgeois brats wouldn't survive a day in an actual communist totalitarian dictatorship. But anyway, that's whose side these like clowns are on, if you want more background. And Yoko does address this in a note at the beginning of the book. Dear reader, since September 2006, there has been concern expressed by some people in the Korean American community regarding this book. So I want to start by saying that what I have written is a remembrance of my own life experience. My intention is not to hurt any individual or nationality, but rather to tell my story of survival in the midst of war and offer my hope for peace. The Japanese occupation in Korea caused deep suffering, sacrifice, and anger. Then and during World War II, countless Korean people were victims. My book was never intended to be a defense of the Japanese. Readers will hear my mother voice her unhappiness with the Tojo government clearly and can draw their own conclusions about my school days in Korea and Japan. War in any country is always chaotic and terrible, brought on by events beyond the control of most people. Individuals, families, and communities on all sides suffer terribly, and yet they still reach out and help one another, showing again and again the humanity of all people. In the book, I tell of the Korean family to whom we are forever grateful. At considerable risk to themselves, this family protected my brother, offering him food, shelter, and friendship. They saved his life. I am very sorry that the Japanese government has not apologized adequately for what happened during the occupation and the war, and has never fully recognized the suffering of the Korean people. As a Japanese American woman, I would like to express my deep regret for the suffering and loss so many experienced. If we are able to have peace and reconciliation in this world, I strongly believe there must be opportunities for understanding and dialogue. My own experience as a young girl escaping from one country to another casts light on the horror of war for all children in all places. Linda Sue Park's When My Name Was Keiko and Suk Nyul Choi's Year of Impossible Goodbyes give different perspectives that also help us understand the consequences of oppression and war. I work to pass on to the young people of the world an understanding of the cruelty, the horror, and the human cost of war. My prayer is for all people to live in peace together. Yoko Kawashima Watkins. And obviously, if you read the book, you will see this is not bashing like Koreans at all, or trying to take like black and white sides and things. Just people just need to actually read and understand what's being written, instead of hearing and immediately reacting or saying, oh, this is in this one box, that it must be automatically bad, and we won't even consider like thinking it's good, or hearing arguments for why it's not like pure evil. And it's just, I would highly recommend it. It's a very inspiring survival story. Lots of difficult things Yoko goes through. She's not privileged at all, and when she's at her new school, the girls don't like her because she has to get like papers from the trash and other school supplies, and she's friends with the janitor. And I forgot to mention, the janitor has a stutter, and that's one of the reasons they bond, because Yoko's father helped a guy with a stutter by speaking very slowly to him, and she always speaks very slowly to Mr. Naida, and gradually his stutter goes away, and like she thinks that's, oh, I'm sorry, his name is Mr. Naido, not Mr. Naida. You know, people do make mistakes when they're reviewing books, and my elephantine memory isn't foolproof. But anyway, it's just like a wonderful, wonderful book, you know, and it's a very fresh perspective if that's not something you're familiar with. And again, I would highly recommend it. I do very apologize if I have been rambling a lot, but I do hope you enjoyed this book review and a take on maybe something you haven't seen in other middle grade March books. And a lot of people seem to be reading, you know, like more like popular and contemporary books than I have, but I know I have very un-mainstream taste. So thank you for watching to the end, and hopefully I will see you again very soon. If you've liked this kind of content, please consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. And thanks for watching. Bye.